Everyone, I think we might make a start. My name is Peter Gray. I'm the director of the Institute of Irish Studies, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all this afternoon to our Irish Studies seminar. And we've got a number of people joining us online as well as in person in the room. I'm absolutely delighted that our speaker today, Martin Doyle, could join us. Martin's got a very busy schedule at the moment, as he's doing many things promoting his new book, which we'll be talking about today. He's got an interview with the BBC later this afternoon, and then there's a formal book launch of the book at the Linen Hall Library later this afternoon, 6 p.m. So I mean, if you hear more from Martin, it'll be a second opportunity. Just make your way down to the Linen Hall Library for 6. So Martin is, as I'm sure as many of you know, the books editor of the Irish Times, which he joined in 2007. He started his journalism career in London in 1990, writing for the Irish World, and then moving to the Irish Post in 1992, where he became editor, before moving on in 2001 to the Times. He's edited a history of the Irish Post, published in 2000, to mark its 30th anniversary. And Martin is a native of Banbridge, and more specifically of Lawrencetown, near Banbridge in County Down, a graduate of the University of St Andrews, where he studied French and German. And he contributed an essay to the 32, an anthology of Irish working class voices in 2021, and has also written a piece for the forthcoming Rutledge Handbook of the Northern Ireland Conflict and Peace. We're here today to hear Martin talk about his new book, which is entitled Dirty Linen, The Troubles in My Home Place. If anyone hasn't seen it, there it is, just published last month by Marion Press in Dublin, and available from all good booksellers. And to give you a sense of what the book is setting out to do, and I'll just kind of quote the publisher's description here. The book offers a personal, intimate history of the Troubles, seen through the microcosm of a single rural parish, his own, that of Tullylish, in County Down, which forms part of both the linen triangle, historically the heartland of the North's defining industry, and also the murder triangle, as it became notoriously referred to in the 1970s, the Badlands devastated by paramilitary violence. And in the book, Martin seeks to lift the veil of silence drawn over the horrors of the past, recording in heartrending detail the terrible toll that the conflict took, including more than 20 violent deaths in the few square miles of the parish of Tullylish, and the long trail of trauma that it has left behind. In the book, neighbours and classmates who lost loved ones in the conflict, survivors maimed in bomb attacks, and victims of sectarianism, both Catholic and Protestant, have entrusted him with their stories. Writing with a literary sensibility, he skillfully shows that the once dominant local linen industry serves as a metaphor for communal division, but also for the solidarity that transcended the sectarian divide. To those who might ask why you would want to reopen old wounds, the answer might be that some wounds have never been allowed to heal. I've spent the last week reading Martin's book and found it's an incredibly humane book in terms of his nuanced and deeply engaged conversations with survivors and the families of survivors and victims, which are interweaved in the book with his own personal experience growing up. And his own family history within the parish as well. I recommend it extremely strongly to everyone as an extremely powerful and insightful personal account of the Troubles. Now, what Martin's going to do for us this afternoon is just talk a little bit about how he came to write the book, and then read an extract from one of the chapters. I've got a few questions to get us going in terms of conversation about the book, and then we welcome questions from the floor, from the people here in the room, and also from anyone who's online as well. So Martin, I'm going to pass over to you to say a bit about the book.
Thanks very much, Peter. So I guess, first of all, thanks very much for coming. The book started off, I was asked by Paul McVeigh, who's a Belfast author, the author of The Good Son, to contribute to this anthology of working class writing. And of course, the first thing I said was, you know, I'm from a working class background, but obviously, you know, fairly middle class, you know, lifestyle now, as book said, of the Irish Times, living in Greystones, etc., etc. And he said that was fine. And then I said, you know, not as if I was trying to get out of it, but then I said, you know, to be honest, you know, growing up in the north of Ireland, class felt like a poor relation compared to sectarianism or whatever, in terms of what I felt held me back or what I was singled out and given a hard time for. And he said, so that's what I'd kind of want to write about. And he said, that's fine too. So left with no alternative, I took on the commission. So I wrote about, and the essay, the original essay was also called Dirty Linen. And the reason for that was my grandfather in 1920 was put out of work as a Catholic, along with all the Catholics along the River Band, which is the heartland of the linen industry, after a number of murders, one political and one not political, just an armed robbery. But it was used as an excuse to kind of give the local Catholic community the kind of the ultimatum: either denounce Sinn Féin, sort of, you know, pledge loyalty to king and country, or you'll be expelled from the workplace. So most Catholics chose not to do so and were expelled. My grandfather went back to the family farm in Rostrevor. His sister emigrated to America, and they never saw each other again. So that's just, in one family, that's just an example of, you know, the effect of sectarianism or whatever. And then I made the link to the modern troubles. I was at school with a fellow called Michael Feeney, and his brother Pat was shot dead in another linen mill in Liddell's in Donaghcloney, which is actually on the Lagan rather than the Band, also in the parish. And Pat was shot dead. He was set up by a colleague who, this was in 1989 when I was at university in St Andrews. And the colleague said to him on the way out, "Now, Pat, see you tomorrow." And Pat said, "See you tomorrow." And the guy did that, knowing that, you know, a UVF gang was coming later that night to murder Pat, who was one of the most harmless people you can imagine, as becomes clear in the book. So Dirty Linen kind of, you know, connecting two events in linen factories decades apart. And also Dirty Linen because it's kind of, you know, walking out of school. It's kind of washing your dirty linen in public. It's saying things that maybe don't get said or don't get said enough. I also talk about, I talk out at school about what happened to me at school. So I'm a Catholic. I went to the nearest grammar school when I passed the 11 plus, which is Banbridge Academy, and suffered, you know, regular commonplace sort of sectarian abuse. Basically, I say in the book, 10% of the pupils were Catholic. It wasn't mixed, it wasn't integrated, it was diluted orange. And that was my experience of being there. I'd say 10% of the pupils were sectarian, and 80% more or less were not, but were not anti-sectarian. They weren't, in the modern phrase, allies. So you just had to sort of suck it up and get on with it. It's funny, somebody asked me at another launch the other day, why didn't you just leave? And, you know, why should I? Like me and my three siblings, we all got a good education there. I went to St Andrews, as did my sister. My brother Shane went to Cambridge, and Gary went to first Edinburgh and then Trinity. So, like, you know, I acknowledge in the book we got a very good education. It was an academic hothouse, but it was also, in the words of David Trimble, a cold house for Catholics. So that's kind of the background. So then, having written that piece, I mentioned in passing some of the other murders in the parish, including the O'Dowd's family. So Barney O'Dowd was my milkman, family milkman, and he sort of stood on our front doorstep every day. So he was a real part of my childhood. On the 4th of January 1976, there was a kind of a family gathering, the last throes of Christmas. So Barney was in the house with his brother Joe, two of his sons, well, several of his sons, but including Declan and Barry, who were, I think, 19 and 22. And there's about 17 people in the house. And the UVF knocked on the door, burst in and shot Barney, seriously injured him. He lost a kidney. Two of his sons were murdered, and his brother Joe were murdered. And then after that incident, so you can imagine, like, Declan was also our coal man. So you can imagine in a small rural parish, you know, the coal man, the milkman, when they get shot, that sort of brings violence to every doorstep in the parish. So that was devastating for our community on both sides, because they served both sides of the community. And then I kind of a call back to what happened to my grandfather and his sister. The family moved south after the violence because the mother, Kathleen, was terrified that the gunmen would come back for the rest of her family. So they moved south to County Meath, and I never saw them again. Until this piece was published in the Irish Times, and Noel, one of the sons, got in touch and said, would you like to meet Barney? He's still alive, 98, but still sharp. And I said, I'd love to. And so that was very moving. Like, you know, this is 45 years later, seeing someone from your childhood that you'd never seen in all that time. And he told me, you know, his story, not just the story of what happened, but also the story of, you know, growing up, starting a business. When he was at school, he went to the local Protestant school in Ballydugan until the local priest tried to move him and his brothers to a Catholic school, and the family resisted, which I kind of thought was interesting. It's one of the things that I do throughout the book. It's not just about the murder. It's not just about the aftermath. It's trying to tell the story of how people lived their lives, not just how their lives were brutally ended. But anyway, the thing that really got me about Barney's story was when Kathleen, his wife, died, the rest of the family sat down and talked, and they decided that they were going to rebury the brothers beside their mother in County Meath. And the thing that really got me was the fact that they decided they would personally exhume their brothers' bodies and rebury them in the south. And like that, to me, was almost unthinkable. I could understand it. It was such an act of love, but also it spoke to me about the trauma of the Troubles, which isn't something that happened to them in 1976. It's something that they live with every day of their lives. And so I wrote that story with their permission, obviously, in the Irish Times. It was an essay called A Ghost Estate and an Empty Grave. And at the end of that essay, I wrote two timelines. One was the timeline of everybody else that was killed with those weapons. And that is the story of the Glenanne gang, which was loyalist paramilitaries in collusion with corrupt members of the security forces, including Robin Jackson, who also lived in Donegal in the parish. But the other timeline was everybody who was killed, who died a violent death in the parish of Tullalish, my parish, during the Troubles. So starting with 3 British soldiers who were blown up in an ex-internees abandoned house in Bleary, just a mile from the O'Dowd's farmhouse, all the way up to a local councillor, the longest serving councillor in Banbridge Council, who died in 1997 of a heart attack during a hoax loyalist bomb scare at the height of the Drumcree dispute. So side by side, I've got Catholics, Protestant civilians, an RUC man, a Territorial Army soldier, part-time soldier, 3 British soldiers, Catholic civilians, Protestant civilians. And so, like, it's one of those things that sort of irks me somewhat on Twitter or on social media. You've got these accounts on this day, the IRA, whatever, which to my mind perpetuate a one-sided attitude towards the Troubles, what them ones did to us ones or whatever. And that's not how I see the Troubles. I see the Troubles as a terrible period in our history, in which every death is to be mourned and deserves, you know, equal attention. So that's the gist.
Thank you, Martin. And you're going to read for us?
Sure.
Yeah. And then we'll look at the questions.
So, like I said, like there's a lot of so basically the book is interviewing relatives of victims, but it's also a few survivors themselves, survivors of bomb attacks, a woman who was blinded in a no warning IRA bomb in Banbridge, and so forth. So, but this, I thought, given that I'm at Queen's today, it's also my story. So I thought I've actually spent a year at Queen's, so I thought I'd read a little bit of it, and to give, you know, a bit of a flavour of the times as well, or my own story. So this chapter is entitled Delinquent Juvenilia. I was a slow learner when it came to realizing that the best thing for me to do was to leave the North. I had started studying French and German at Queen's University Belfast in October 1985. On the 15th of November that year, Margaret Thatcher and Garret Fitzgerald had signed the Anglo-Irish Agreement, resulting in a wave of unionist protests and increased tension. Belfast was not buzzing back then, it was ticking. I attended a talk by an SDLP politician held inappropriately in the Catholic student chaplaincy. As I entered, after walking from my home off the Lisburn Road, I looked over my shoulder, worried about more than my street cred. Only 4 other students had turned up. Surveying this, the politician, instead of turning the lecture into a seminar by offering to buy us all a drink, turned tail. Political activism at Queen's was a dangerous business. Edgar Graham, a 29-year-old law lecturer and a rising star in the Ulster Unionist Party, was murdered by the IRA, shot dead outside the University Library on the 7th of December 1983, 2 years before I matriculated. Sheena Campbell, a 29-year-old law student and a rising star in Sinn Féin, was murdered by the UVF, shot dead in the York Hotel on Botanic Avenue near Queen's on the 16th of October 1992, 2 years after I graduated. Her mother was from Tullabish. Having tried the year before to persuade one of my best friends, Andy, to stay and study in Belfast, I now was thinking of following in his footsteps and transferring to Edinburgh University, where he was a student, or to the University of St Andrews, where my sister Andrea was studying. I saw myself as a moderate. I had a relative in the police and we played squash together in the bowels of the fortress that was Lurgan RUC station. In my time at Queen's, I played snooker in the Felons Club on the Falls with a student whose father had been a Republican prisoner, a requirement for membership. I was an equal opportunity sportsman. I lived near the Loyalist village area and faced a moral dilemma when Neighbours knocked, collecting for a Loyalist band. Inspiration struck. Law student doesn't even understand decimal currency, they must have said when they emptied their tin. That's a callback to an episode earlier in the book. I used to collect my grandparents' washing, and usually my grandmother would pay me for my trouble, a couple of shillings, but Granda sometimes was there, and he was a good bit older and a lot tighter. So I came home with a very crestfallen face and a 2p coin and said to my mother, I don't think Granda understands decimal currency. It's here, I must admit, that I used to write poems or songs or a misconceived combination of the two, which I shall christen pongs. I wish I had kept a diary instead, but there you go. Most are truly terrible, delinquent juvenilia. 1 or 2, though, at least capture something of how I felt at the time. A summer or 2 later, a friend recorded himself singing this, accompanying himself on the guitar, with the accidental sound effect of someone ringing the doorbell in the middle of it. And it wasn't bad, honestly. Staring through a slit in the curtains, wondering if it's curtains for me, hearing a crash or loud voices outside, but there's no place to hide behind the settee. Walking down rundown streets, wanting to run down rundown streets, almost embarrassed to be always alert, wary of a slowing car. The heat of the day clouds my mind, gets in my way, stops me from sleeping, then poisons my dreams. A drought of tears is all that keeps me from weeping. A draught of fear sends me creeping into my jeans. And I guess I am just an unpicked victim, waiting in the wings, an unselected statistic, hoping that peace is what tomorrow brings. When I did transfer to study in St Andrews, I attended a creative writing class with the poet Douglas Dunn, who commented on the musicality of my work and compared it, not necessarily favourably, to bagpipe music by Louis MacNeice. When Thomas McCarthy mentioned in his book Poetry, Memory and the Party, Journals 1974 to 2014, that he'd met Dunn and found him rather depressed, I must admit checking whether the date coincided with my time in his writing class. My upbringing, my class background has not completely defined me, but it certainly colours how I perceive the world and understand society. Our sky was lower, our horizons closer. Our first and only family holiday abroad was to Brittany by boat just before my 16th birthday. That said, we were lucky in that Daddy's parents lived near Courtown, the County Wexford seaside resort, and bonus points, my Aunt Kathleen owned a chip shop, meaning free chips. To replicate that buzz as an adult, you'd need to be a gambler in Vegas. At the time, alienation was the buzzword to describe how Catholics felt in a gerrymandered state designed to deny them their rights and identity. I felt the buzz of recognition when I read how Stephen Ray admired the appropriate disrespect his fellow Queen's student Eamon McCann had shown to the authorities in the late 1960s. But I never succumbed to the nihilistic extreme of nationalism that was happy for our gutters to run red while only our rivers ran free. The peace process when it started felt miraculous. The Troubles were all I had known. Only the Christmas ceasefires gave an annual inkling of a life free of fear and horror. The Good Friday Agreement felt like a monumental compromise, endorsed by former extremists on both sides, leaving the reactionary naysayers of the DUP isolated. In time, even they would come on board, but in embracing Brexit, they helped dismantle the European Union framework that provided a common European home for rival national identities. There must be no border between the North and Britain, they insist, except hypocritically on social issues such as abortion. The prospect of a return to violence appalls me. Equally, the rise of the middle ground and a more pluralist society and the rejection of the old binaries of religious and national identity give me hope. Regardless of whether a referendum on reunification is held and won, I would like to see ever closer links between North and South, and East and West for that matter. In such a scenario, everybody wins. In the 1970s, ugly oil drums filled with concrete and linked by scaffolding poles used to divide Banbridge's High Street from through traffic. Later, pretty flower beds and coffin-like troughs fulfilled that function. But every summer, another hardy perennial is allowed to colonise what should be a shared civic space in a mixed town. The red, white and blue bunting and Union flags of one tradition are strung up along the street, and a triumphalist orange arch spans it, while side streets sport loyalist paramilitary flags. A party that excludes 40% of the population. What is that but Protestant privilege? If discrimination and domination are bad, does it really have to be said that indiscriminate murder is so much worse? A fortnight before the Omagh bombing on the 15th of August 1998, in which 29 people were murdered, the real IRA planted a similar £500 car bomb in Banbridge. Luckily, no one was killed. For me, the deepest divide was and always will be between those on all sides, including the state, who supported the taking of life for political ends, and those who opposed it. As John Montagu wrote in a response to Omagh, "All I can do is curse, complain. Who can endorse such violent men, as history creaks on its bloody hinge, and the unspeakable is done again? With no peace after the deluge, no ease after the storm, we learn to live inside ruin like a second home." Every August, a human effigy is trundled up the cut on a tumbrel by the local branch of the Apprentice Boys of Derry and set on fire on the Downshire Bridge. A human sacrifice, more wicker man than burning man, more folk horror than folk festival, like a gothic fever dream from an Andrew Michael Hurley novel. The effigy is of Lundy, who wanted to surrender during the siege of Derry. The contemporary message to Unionist leaders is, compromise at your peril. A war memorial stands at the top of the town, and a smaller one beside it honours members of the security forces killed in the Troubles. But there is nothing to commemorate civilians such as Pat Campbell, no Stolpersteine to make a new generation stumble and turn away from bad old ways. You will find a memorial to the Melmy Show Band in Dublin, another just off the dual carriageway where the killings took place, and there's a plaque on lead singer Fran O'Toole's old home in Bray, but nothing in the town they played for the night they were murdered. In the words of Kim Wagner, historian of the British Empire, "We are not responsible for the past, but we are responsible for what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget."
Martin, if I could start perhaps just picking up on that last point you made there, the absence of shared sites of memory, of memorialization relating to the Troubles. You mentioned several places in your book, the 1999 book, Lost Lives, by David McKittrick et al., which does attempt to create that kind of inclusive, it often be described as a site of memory, but very much inclusive, a place where everyone can go and see all the deaths from whatever causation and from whatever background reflected in one place. Do you see your own book as in some ways trying to do something similar, to create a site of memory, which is inclusive, and obviously much more local in its focus, but also more intimate in its extensive conversations with survivors and victims?
Lost Lives is a huge influence. It was a resource, but it was also, you know, in part an inspiration. So yeah, I'm zooming in on one parish. And giving a lot more detail than it would be possible, was possible in Lost Lives. There is another book, Susan McKay's Bear in Mind He's Dead, which is I think a John Hewitt quotation, which is maybe somewhere in between. Susan, I think, is trying to tell the story of the Troubles, the entire Troubles, through, you know, a more detailed look at particular murders and how families were affected by it. Mine is very much zooming in on just one parish. There are other works that, like, I think Silent Testimony, the series of artworks by Colin Davidson, does, you know, something similar in another medium, and there is a crossover with my book, because Silent Testimony is a series of portraits of victims of the Troubles, as in relatives of people who were killed, or in the case of Margaret Yeaman, she was an estate agent in Banbridge, and she was blinded in a no-warning IRA bomb in 1982, in which an 11-year-old pupil, Alan McCrum, was murdered, waiting for a lift home. And sorry, lost my thread. So I interviewed Margaret about how Colin Davidson painted her and persuaded her to take off the glasses, the dark glasses which she wore to kind of, you know, protect her privacy when she was out in public. And it's such a poignant story. And Colin allowed her to touch she was the only person who was allowed to touch her painting, because obviously she couldn't see it. And that to me was a very powerful story. So I think what Colin is doing in his paintings, they create a mood and an atmosphere, and likewise they bring together people from all sides of the community, and they're hung side by side. And so I think it's really important that people be remembered collectively, not just individually. Like I was speaking to you just before we started today. There's a man in the book, Eamon Kearns, two of whose sons were murdered in October 1993. The 30th anniversary just passed last weekend. So they just celebrated Roisin, their 11-year-old daughter's 11th birthday party, when Eamon and Sheila, the parents, went to an Irish language class nearby in Lurgan. And while they were away, again, a UVF gang they didn't burst into the house, they walked in because the back door was open. So you still have that level of kind of countryside trust or whatever, and brutally exploited or betrayed. So the two boys were murdered in front of their sister. You can imagine what it's like celebrating your birthday every year since, you know, when it is tainted in that way by the murder of your brothers. Eamon's birthday is the 11th of the 11th, ironically. And Eamon said to me, you know, every year he watches the remembrance commemorations for, you know, people who died, soldiers who died in the First World War, the Second World War. And he says, you know, I watch that and I weep for those soldiers and those families. I can understand their grief, but I'm supposed to move on. I'm told by church and state, whatever, to stop, you know, pursuing justice for my sons. Like his sons almost certainly were the victims of collusion. And so, and again, I know that Eamon and his family, they feel a bit abandoned by all sides, I guess, you know, by the church. Like he talks about the priest, the parish priest who would come and stand on his doorstep, wouldn't actually come into the house, just stood on the threshold, offered him some missals or prayers or whatever. Everyone turns up to a funeral. In Catholic tradition, there's a month's mind. So a month after the death, there's a service. There'll be a big crowd at that. The first anniversary, not so many. And as years go on, I imagine, I know it dwindles to just immediate family and closest friends. So there is a sense of isolation, I think, for victims and victims' families. You know, we have, you know, a commemoration for the dead of the First World War and the Second World War, but we don't have a collective commemoration for the victims of the Troubles. And I think that's something that needs to be addressed. I think they deserve their day. I was talking to somebody recently, actually, and they said that there is a campaign for some kind of a national day of mourning or whatever. Now, I can see from practical terms, you know, there's not going to be much desire for a bank holiday on the 11th of November, but I think there's a suggestion that there might be one in the summer. And I think that would be a very positive thing. I think it would be something that would unite all sides of the community. Like you had the recent disgraceful legacy bill corralled through by the British government. And I remember being, you know, moved myself by the DUP MP Jim Shannon weeping in the House of Commons at the outrageousness of the denial of justice to victims and their families. So I think that is something that all sides could come together around.
In the section of your book where you talk about Margaret Yeaman and Colin Davidson's Simon Tesme, also bringing Effie McWilliams' Belfast Women sculpture.
Yes.
And throughout the book, there are references obviously to works of creative writing as well. I mean, do you think art has a role both in terms of addressing the trauma of individuals and perhaps appealing society as a whole?
I think so. Like obviously, you know, I bring different things to this book. I bring, you know, my local knowledge or connections, you know, in terms of getting access to the families that I talk to in the book. You know, my day job or, you know, my career has been, you know, largely writing about the arts or whatever. And they've certainly taught me a lot, like fiction and non-fiction. But let's you know, look at, say, Louise Kennedy's Trespasses or Jan Carson's The Raptures or The Firestarters. You know, these can teach us things about the Troubles as well, about history, about society. And I'd say poetry, you know, like there's a lot of darkness in the book. So like, you know, I'll be honest and sort of say I included poetry, not just because it kind of it can tell a story like the John Montague poem about Oma that I read there, but also it kind of, you know, it brings threads of beauty or whatever to, you know, what can be quite a dark narrative. So it's funny though, I was zooming in, if you bring out a book, you suddenly become interested in bookshops more than you might otherwise. And I was zooming in to sort of see where the nearest bookshops were to Tullalish. And I thought, great, there's one in Bleary. Didn't know that. And of course, I zoomed closer in and it's an evangelical bookshop. And then I started looking all over the north and there's loads of Bible shops and Christian bookstores. So if I'd known that, I might have put in a few more psalms and a few less poems, but there you go.
So throughout the book, you're interweaving, I mean, as you just summed up for us in the extract you read, you're interweaving your own personal memoir with very forensic accounts of these atrocities, episodes of atrocity and their aftermath, and then these deeply moving interviews with survivors and relatives of victims. This must take a toll on you as a writer and as an individual, if you are taking a lot of trauma onto yourself through these interviews with people who have been so deeply hurt over such a long period of time. I mean, how has writing this book affected you personally, do you think?
I think, you know, the other thread, I guess, that I bring to this is that, you know, I suffered my own bereavement. My wife passed away 10 years ago next month of cancer. And obviously that's a different type of trauma to our of bereavement rather, than the complicated grief of violent death. But still, it made me dwell a lot on how you remember the lost loved one, whatever, like how you preserve memories. Like I mentioned in the book how in the early days, there's quite a lot of suppressing goes on just to kind of get through. But then over time, it becomes very important to kind of actually, almost dig irrigation channels or whatever to kind of preserve memories or whatever. So I think I brought, an empathy, like, you shouldn't need to kind of have lost a loved one yourselves to kind of dwell on the terrible loss that your neighbours have suffered. But, I'm just saying it kind of sharpens the focus, and, you do understand, at a much deeper level what they must have gone through. So I guess, it was a kind of at one level, it was an exercise in displacement activity. I was kind of writing about, my own loss or understanding, the depth of loss or whatever by talking to my neighbours about what they had experienced. Some, there are some things that, every time I read them, like, they would move me to tears, like Margaret Yeaman, the woman who was blinded, talking about not wanting to leave hospital because she wanted to stay until, her eyes were fixed. She originally thought it was her eyelids or whatever else. She didn't realize, just how bad her injuries were. That's pretty devastating. And then having to or wanting to eat by herself in the kitchen rather than in front of people because she felt very self-conscious, without her sight. That's devastating to kind of dwell on that. And then, sorry, there's another person, Donna Campbell, her story about, I think she was 10, when she witnessed her father's murder. He was shot dead, the first victim of Robin Jackson, who became a serial killer, supposedly in the pay of the state. Like that makes for extremely complicated grief. If like her mother, who opened the door to Robin Jackson, identified him in an ID parade, and yet still that wasn't good enough to secure a conviction. And he went on to kill more than 50 other people. But like her story is, she was called from her bedroom just at the end of the hall, and her father was lying there surrounded by glass, and her mum says, hold your daddy's head, keep him still, don't let him get cut. And she's saying, or she's thinking, but there's this massive hole or whatever in his chest. That's pretty devastating. And then there's this story that she tells, like, she's talking, like, people are really honest about, what they will tell you, and they're happy to share. And she was, suffering badly from depression. She had all her life, she had never really associated it with, in her teenage years, she hadn't really associated with what had happened to her dad. But there was this episode with a box of fur. So her dad was a shop steward in the shoe factory in Banbridge. She used to work on slippers, whatever. And then the routine was they would come home, and the boys, the two brothers, would give the dad a slipper each, and Donna would take his white coat, his work factory coat, off. And one day she found a little bit of fur from a slipper, a clipping from a slipper that he'd made, in the pocket. And then he used to bring home, just little kind of slivers of fur or whatever, and then put it in a box, and she would play with it a bit like Furbies or something, I guess. And she was lying in bed, and this is, years later, as a mother herself, lying in bed, unhappy, angry, whatever, and then thinking, oh, I need to bring this coat to the dry cleaners, but I can't wash it because it's got fur. And then she thought the fur, and then she started went looking for stuff. And all these memories came flooding back about the box of fur. And even think about it now, I'm kind of almost welling up or whatever. Like, and then she sort of told her mum about it the next day. And her mum said, did your daddy speak to you? Her mum was always sort of, encouraging her to listen, and her dad would speak to her. And Donna says, he didn't speak to me, he was there. And so she had this kind of, really profound connection, memory, sense memory of her father, which is, profoundly affecting every time. Yeah, it doesn't diminish. with repetition.
One more question from me, and then I'll open it to the floor. So many of the accounts of the episodes that you address in the book bring up evidence of systemic collusion between paramilitaries, particularly the UVF Glenanne gang and the state, both in the commission and then cover-up of what happened. And this evidence of collusion is hugely important to many of the survivors and relatives that you speak to as well. How confident are you that the truth of these events will ever be legally acknowledged? So this is something you talk about on through a number of case studies.
It's a strange one because you know, a lot of the people that I was interviewing, I was almost sort of traveling in the wake of John Boucher, who's now the interim chief constable of the PSNI. So John Boucher has been, for the last 5 years, been working on 2 major reports, Canova, which is about the steak knife series of murders. And the suggestion is that steak knife Freddy Scappaticci was, you know, a British agent responsible for many deaths, and therefore the British state indirectly is responsible for many of those deaths. So that report is due out any day now. And then the second report is into the Glenanne gang. It's called the Denton report, and he told me like he couldn't really say anything to me because obviously, you know, it's confidential. But he did say that he hoped that it would be brought out for the 40th anniversary of the 50th anniversary of the Dublin London bombings next May as a target date. So for a lot, I know for a fact that some families that he has been talking to, and like they had placed a lot of trust in him, and they're now kind of thinking, you know, they're like he'd sort of said to them, I will pursue the truth wherever it goes, no matter how high. And like, you know, talking to, you know, to one of the people that I interviewed, and he now sort of feels, you know, he was sort of thinking, you know, you said to me you were going to go to right to the top shelf if needs be, but now you are the top shelf. So, you know, and I sort of said to him, listen, you know, don't prejudge. Let's see what happens. It could be possible that, you know, with him in that position, that puts him in the ideal position to actually kind of follow through. It'll certainly be seen as a huge betrayal if the Denton report into the Glenanne gang is suppressed, or if it is watered down so much that it's all but meaningless. I would like to think that it will come out and that it won't be sort of, you know, covered in black ink so that, you know, we won't be any further forward. I would love nothing more than this book to be out of date within 6 months. If the Denton report comes out next May and tells us a lot of details, a lot more details about who's responsible and what the RUC knew, what the special branch knew, like in terms of the O'Dowd's murders. I have heard names that have been mentioned as to those 3 people arrested the night of the O'Dowd's murders, and it's my understanding that one of them is a relative of Robin Jackson, for example, and that puts a whole new perspective on, like, Robin Jackson was never even questioned about that murder. It puts a whole new perspective on it if RUC Special Branch knew almost immediately who was responsible, and then for him not even to have been arrested for that crime. So honestly, at this point, I don't know. John Boucher's got a very good track record, and a lot of the families have a lot of faith in him. But, you know, it remains to be seen. As one of the families said, you know, they said to him, you know, you're not the first man trying to get to the truth here. You know, you've had Stalker, you've had John Stevens, and they've all been run out of Dodge. So is John Boucher going to be the latest in a long line of senior British police officers run out of Dodge? Wait and see.
Watch this space. Mark, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let me open it up to the floor and also to people online. If you'd like to ask a question, you can type a question into the comment or the chat box, or electronically raise your hand and I'll unmic you. Yeah.
No,
Congratulations on the vote.
thanks very much.
So I am a PhD researcher over at the School of Law, and my research looks at rural experiences of victimhood in Northern Ireland. And one of the things I'm looking at is like the rural-urban differences of dealing with the past. So, for example, rural geographical isolation and access to support services, or you had mentioned the likes of countryside trust, so like the likes of suspicion and what that means if there's an official truth recovery process, just those rural intimate details. I wonder if you have any perspectives on this from your own lived experience with your parish or with your injuries.
I guess there's there is a lot of it in the book, the O'Dowds and the Kearnses. They live within the Slopes is a back road in Leary, Ballydugan. The O'Dowd murders were January the 4th, 1976, and then the Kearns murders were October the 29th, 1993, and yet temporally quite far apart, and yet geographically, I would say 500 yards, if that. And in both of the cases, they feel very strongly that they strongly suspect, local involvement, certainly local knowledge. Like the O'Dowds, Noel brought me to the old abandoned farmhouse. That's something that will stay with me forever. I sort of make the point that there's this is going off to the side, whatever, but I think it should be in control. I think, well, obviously with the family's blessing or whatever, but, Kiltraw is a sort of celebration. It was designed as this kind of folk park celebrating, the fabric, the built heritage of the north of Ireland. And there's a weaver's cottage from my parish. There's a watchtower, like the Linen Watchtower from my parish. And I think there's actually at the old Catholic church from Drumcree, of all places, just outside the parish. And I kind of think, let's have a murder house in Kiltraw. Let's have the abandoned O'Dowd's farmhouse in Kiltraw, because that's part of our history, all too large a part of our history. But so the O'Dowd's is down this kind of it's a back road to begin with, and then it's down this long laneway. You can't even see it from the road. It's like kind of a dog leg kind of farm lane. So, you'd really have to know it was there. And they say, and the people didn't come down. The killers, the dog didn't bark. They didn't hear a car. They think the killers came across fields down a sort of back lane. So again, that level of local knowledge is, it really does point to a neighbour having been complicit in that murder, if not actually taking part in it. Like Barney O'Dowd believed that he had identified one of the killers, somebody that he knew from the parish. The police were adamant it wasn't him, it was Jackson, despite not arresting Jackson, despite that feeling. The man that Barney identified was arrested and held for 3 days, and they tested his clothing and they found gunpowder residue on his coat in several places, and he had no explanation for it, and yet no charges. So that sort of stuff. And with the Kearnses, again, strong. The family has a strong suspicion that they were set up by people who live near them, and that's hard to live with. And every family is different. The O'Dowds moved away. The Kearnses still live in the house where those 2 boys were murdered. Again, I can understand that. You do have a real attachment to a place where you have lived with. That's where all of your memories are. So it would be very hard to leave, but also I imagine very hard to live with as well. And also on the other side, Robert Harrison, the son of Bobby Harrison, the RUC man who was killed in Guildford. Again, he strongly believes that there must have been kind of a local connection. The phone call was from a public phone box a couple of miles away. He believes there must have been a lookout, as well as the gunman. There must have been a lookout hiding around the corner as part of the operation for it to have, been successful. So that's painful. Even after his father's murder, his mother's those graffiti spread by local youths on the cars and on the fence of the family home, and Robert's wife's family home, both in the same estate, and local people were convicted of that. Like that's hard to live with. And not only have you suffered violent bereavement, but you're not even allowed to kind of grieve in peace. You're being kind of taunted by your neighbours. So there's all too many examples of it. I think the difference maybe, like, urban areas in Belfast were traditionally quite segregated with peace lines and so forth, whereas the Ban is sort of perceived as a kind of a fault line, or used to be in the north. West of the Ban, more Catholic, more agricultural. East of the Ban, more industrial, predominantly Protestant. But we lived along the Ban, and along the Ban, people lived cheek by jowl. Like RUC men lived in housing estates where a significant number of local Catholics lived and felt safe to do so. And they drank in my local pub, Lavery's in Lawrencetown. Like the local RUC man, community policeman, was interested in racing pigeons, whatever. And so like there's a level of kind of trust, if you like. And yet the suspect in the O'Dowd's case, who was arrested and found with gunpowder residue, lived in the same estate. So
thank you. I have a question from Cathal McLaughlin, who's online. So given the risk of re-traumatization when someone recounts their story, how did you address this, if and when it arose?
The first thing is I approach people, very discreetly. Either I knew them personally or my parents knew them personally, and asked them, were they willing to talk? Would they be happy to talk about it? In a couple of instances, the answer came back, and very touchingly, they sort of said they're really sorry, but it was too painful, like nothing to apologize for. And I absolutely, I wasn't sort of, knocking on anybody's door, cold calling anyone. So if people didn't want to talk, I absolutely didn't kind of pursue it. I found another way of telling the story. So in the case of Joe Fagan, the first person from the parish to die violently, he was killed at the Newry Customs Post bomb along with 7 others, including the 3 IRA bombers whose bomb went off prematurely. So Joe Fagan's family, the 2 that I sort of approached didn't feel able to talk about it. So my colleague at the Irish Times, Simon Carswell, had interviewed the other lorry driver who was killed in the same explosion. Joe Fagan was a lorry driver. And so she agreed to talk. She'd already spoken to Simon about it, and she agreed to speak to me about it. So I guess at one remove, I told the story of what happened to Joe Fagan by telling the story of what happened to Jack McCann, to Mary Casey's father, in the same bombing. When I interviewed Richard Beattie, whose father by the same name was killed 4 days before the O'Dowds in the Guildford pub bombing, I make the point that if you Google Guildford pub bombing, it doesn't bring you to 3 people were murdered in Guildford in my parish, in 3 Protestant civilians in an ILA, no warning ILA bombing. But if you Google it, it brings you to the Guildford pub bombing in Surrey. So again, that to me is a really strong example of erasure. 3 human beings lost their lives. You can imagine the ripples of harm and trauma caused by that. And yet the Google algorithm erases them from history. They're, even if you put in their details, it leads you elsewhere. So for what? For nothing. So I talked to Richard, and he said to me that he had never even spoken to his family before. Like, I personally believe it's not healthy to repress or suppress memories or trauma. I think sunlight is the best disinfectant. I think it is important in a sensitive way to talk about things and talk about it with somebody you trust. So I guess he was sort of taking me on trust or whatever. And I guess part of my story was the fact that I had been bereaved, as I said, not violently bereaved, but I had my own personal experience of that and receiving counselling and so forth. So I guess I was coming from a place of care, and also sort of, and believing that, talking is a good thing to do as opposed to repressing memories. So there were a couple of moments where, he's sort of, it was actually talking about his mother's death, not his father who had died violently, but when his mother died, I think that, triggered something, profound. And, he did, he was struggling, whatever, like, so we took a bit of time out and I began talking about my own experience. So, I'm not a professional counselor. So, people might think, you are sort of stumbling your way through somebody else's trauma, but it didn't really feel like that. It honestly didn't. And I kind of think, Robert Harrison, whose dad, the RE seaman Bobby Harrison, died. I was inviting him to the launch, and he felt he wasn't able to come because his wife, who I'd also met when I interviewed him, had recently died a few months ago. And we had this exchange about, we both lost our wives or whatever. Like, so I thought that was actually, very, very moving or whatever, that, we have this connection or this bond of trust or whatever that, I'd say politically we are quite far apart, but in terms of, human experience or whatever, there is a genuine empathy there.
Okay. Yes, Bryce.
Your book sounds wonderful, Mark, and I look forward very much to reading it.
Thanks.
A couple of points of information before the question. There is already a Victims' Day in Northern Ireland, supposedly the 21st of June, but not many victims groups or other organisations really, celebrate it or take advantage of it. But it has potential for being that kind of Victims' Day, which the Spanish, for example, have in relation to mass problem. And in relation to John Voucher, he's gone on record already to say that the Operation QUB report, which, as you say, is due out very soon, has been through the security clearance, and not a word of what he wrote has been altered by those authorities. So that gives us some hope that the Operation Denton report will be the same.
Mm-hmm.
But I wonder, and you passed some critical remarks about the Legacy Act. Did you ask the survivors of the killings that you talked about what it was they really wanted today, and was there a strong preference for justice over information, or did you think that they'd be satisfied if they learned a lot more about why their loved one was killed and who might have been involved, even though that person gets immunity for prosecution under the Legacy Act? Did they express a preference either way?
I don't think I really got into that level of detail with many or any of them. Like, the truth is that, how much time would anybody serve if they were convicted now? Almost no time. So I think what they do want is truth, the truth. And I think, it's like I sort of say, these wounds have never been allowed to heal because they've been contaminated. I think that's particularly the case where there is the suspicion or even the evidence of collusion. So, I think, honestly, I hope my book helps, but I'd be humble enough to sort of say that I think the John Boucher report, if it delivers, would make an awful lot more difference to those families affected by it. Just to kind of know the truth and have some acknowledgement that the state did play a part, maybe for thinking it was doing the right thing in the bigger picture or whatever. But frankly, I struggle to understand how running informers who are involved in murders, and like the Finucane murder, like there's something absurd, like over 100 people involved in his murder were in some way agents of the state. Like, what were they preventing? Because so much went ahead. It's beyond my comprehension.
Peter.
You went to St Andrews, and then did I hear correctly that you were editor of the Irish Post?
Yes.
So presumably you've spent a lot of your life outside Northern, like your adult life.
Yes.
And how might that have either helped? Because I wouldn't understand people leaving here and kind of turning them back on it. How might a certain amount of distance allowed you? I know you, of course, got family connections. That how might living outside here allowed you to do something like this? Or alternatively, your attitudes, presumably you lived in England therefore if you're at Irish Post.
Yeah, I graduated in 1990 from St Andrews and moved to London that October. I joined the Irish World and where was it then? Dulles Hill, no, Wilson High Road. And then Irish and Britain News, which was Brentford, and then Irish Post, Hayes Middlesex, and then Hammersmith. You know, I guess I didn't live in the north. I didn't return to the north, but by working in Irish journalism for, like, I spent 9 years working for more than 9 years, guts of 11 years working for Irish newspapers in London. So I was very plugged into, you know, both the arts. You know, I was arts editor, but then I was deputy editor. So I was interviewed Mark McGuinness, Jerry Adams, David Irvin, David Trimble, John Krishnan. You know, so a lot of politicians. I was, you know, I was involved in, you know, I guess a lot of the stuff around the peace process or whatever, which was fascinating to me, but also interviewing people like, you know, Owen McNamee when Resurrection Man came out. You know, lots of Blackstaff books, whatever. So very connected to my living there. Distance, you know, I don't know if I would have written this book if I still lived here. I think, you know, I kind of like the kind of living at a remove. So it's a funny area, and I kind of made it. I think there's quite a connection between the experience of being, you know, an Irish person from the north and being an Irish person living in Britain. I think both are kind of outgroups. Like now I'm kind of, you know, you could say at the heart of the Southern establishment, books editor of the Irish Times. But I still see, you know, I think there is a, you know, from the mainstream of the Irish nation, if you like, is the South. The North is a bit of a, Irish people in the North, they're a bit of an outgroup. And I think the Irish in Britain, the diaspora generally, are a bit of an outgroup. And so that's one kind of big connection for me. And the other one is the IRS campaign of violence had a devastating effect on, well, on the whole community in the North, but like certainly the Catholic population in the North, the civilian population suffered disproportionately as a result. And I think the Irish in Britain also suffered significantly. They became a suspect community. In other words, I think Paddy Hilliard wrote a book. And that was my experience to a degree as well. Like, you know, there was a lot of harassment and just general hostility as well. So living at a remove, I still sort of felt, you know, quite a strong connection. I thought there was kind of parallels between the two experiences. Yes.
Mine is actually slightly related to that question about geography and positioning, and it's about, and maybe better able to answer this after you've done your tour of the north of the Lindenmore Library and so on, but it's about the reception of the book in the South, because it must be interesting, because there's been all this stuff recently about the Stowe Festival and the controversy there, and Patrick Keelty of the Northerner taking over the Late Show. And I guess I'm just wondering if any of that has surfaced in the reception of your book so far.
You know, it hasn't broken through into the, like, it's striking to me that it's in, for example, it's in the top 1,000. It's been in the top 500. It's always been in the top 1,000 on Amazon, which is kind of quite significant for an Irish book, whatever, for an Irish title. So it's selling, but it's not selling terribly large numbers in the South. Like, I've just been signing more books in Dromore. They've sold out. That's probably the nearest bookshop to the town. So, like, you know, there's definitely interest in the North. There's a degree of interest, like, there's getting very positive, like, nobody is, you know, there's been very positive response in the South. But then maybe Conor O'Cleary, who's a former colleague, but he's actually from the North. And so, and then Cathal Goan, again, another Northerner who is former Director General of the RT. He's one of the blurbs in the book. So,
you know, I'd say there, like, you know, I do know as books editor of the Irish Times, you know, you'd be kind of thinking twice before you'd have 2 lead reviews in the section about the North. That's the truth, you know. There is kind of a degree of resistance in a lot of media, you know. RTE still waiting for the call from them to, you know, to be on the radio. I've done Pat Kenny, I've done Matt Cooper on, these are independent radio stations, done a lot of kind of regionals and whatever. As yet, nothing from RTE. So, you know, there is a resistance. Like, you know, it's well known that there was, you know, a strong sort of cabal in the Southern media, very hostile to Northern nationalism, never mind republicanism. You know, are there still elements of that? I think there probably are. But I think hopefully the story is written, like Anne Cadwallader wrote Lethal Allies. She's sort of done the kind of Glenanne gang story. So, you know, I've drawn on Anne's research, absolutely. But, you know, what I'm trying to do is somewhat different. It's a bit more akin to Susan McKay's Bear in Mind These Dead, except with a much tighter focus. And I hope that by, you know, by having the emphasis maybe more on the human stories, like I'm not at all shying away from, you know, the collusion, but of course that's only one side, because, you know, there are Protestant victims as well, and the British soldiers, whatever. Because it's maybe more holistic, I think that will kind of maybe bring more people into the tent. And I think because it's written with a kind of a literary sensibility, if you like, you know, easy for me to say, but, you know, like the response generally has been that, you know, although it's a very dark story, it is actually, you know, written in an accessible way. Like it is kind of balancing act. I wanted to write a book that my neighbours could read, that maybe, you know, like I said, there's no bookshop in Banbridge. There's just literally just Waterstones has just opened in Craigavon. Perfect timing. But, you know, this is something that I want to kind of work at many levels or whatever. And, you know, hopefully it will transcend. But wait and see.
Question at the back.
Hi.
An early one.
Hi, yes, that.
It just follow up from that question. You think the time of the book launch maybe was off with the books of Ethan Moore and Maria Clavel both hitting the shelves at the same time and coming from the north?
You know, there's a lot of books about it. Like, you know, one of the reasons I went with Merriam Press as my publisher, like Conor Graham, like they're based in Newbridge, Kildare, but Conor is from Hollywood, same town as Louise Kennedy. And the reason I went with them is they did really well with Old Ireland Colour, so deep pockets, but also, you know, Conor has a real connection to the north. He's got a really strong list: Steak Knife, The Padre. You know, like the shortlist. You know, my book is on the non-fiction shortlist for the Irish Book Awards, along with Ethan Moore's book, along with help me out here now. There's 2 or 3, like my son was sort of looking at it. Violence. Oh, sorry, there's a Thread of Violence by Mark McConnell, which is about the notorious Malcolm McDowell, what's his name?
QUB.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, and my son's going violence, Sinn Féin, murder, whatever. So, like, you know, there is, you know, there are a lot of books. There always are a lot of books. Timing, it was as early, like I wanted to get it out this year, and like it was kind of rushed. You know, it wasn't rushed out. That makes it sound, you know, like it was thrown together, whatever. Like, but yeah, I didn't want to wait until next March or whatever. Like, you know, this is a good time to kind of bring out books in terms of, you know, with the Christmas market around the corner. That's me brutal. Like, you know,
What you're saying there,
big pardon.
just about what you're saying, I found a very tough read. And then it was, you're talking about your parish and I come from my parish, and we could compare those at a later date.
Sure.
But
Where are you from, Sam?
the Shankill, and I consider that to be my parish.
Yes.
I found it very disturbing, on the fact that there was a lot of collusion, and I have to look at within myself to see that, but also the similarities. The neighbours are involved, the family are involved, and it's the milkman, it's the coal man,
Yeah.
the guy in the street who suffers the most.
Yeah.
of this.
But also, like, they were connected themselves. Like, you know, like Bobby Harrison and Barney O'Dowd. They, you know, politically, they disagreed, obviously, but, you know, they were neighbours and they got on. Like Noel O'Dowd says, there's a lot of respect there. Robert Harrison as well. And like, it was a very touching thing in the book where Bobby Harrison's wife Gladys, you know, her best friend growing up was a woman called McInerney in the townland of Tullinish, and they would meet up every Sunday. And Mrs. McInerney would go to half 8 mass in Lawrencetown, and Mrs. Harrison would go to 11:30 service in Tullinish, and in between they would meet for tea and sandwiches, whatever. And you know, so I think that's a really important thing. And like, wherever, you know, I find these kind of threads that kind of bring people together, like, you know, one of the victims in the darts club, the guy who was, you know, the one person who was shot and survived, what's his name, Freddie Armstrong, I think, Freddie Thompson. And, you know, he was one of the few Protestants there or whatever. Like, but I kind of say, you know, like, you know, the loyalist paramilitaries who shot him, they'll probably think, well, he shouldn't have been there. And I'm saying he absolutely should have been there. Like, people like that there who kind of, you know, socialize across the divide, they are the mortar that held this place together. They are the best of us, frankly, who lived lives beyond prejudice, beyond their bubbles. And another thing that I say in the book as well about, like, you know, religion gets a very bad rap, and frankly, rightly so, for its role in the conflict. Like, you know, the bigotry of EMPs, whatever, is absolutely one of the, you know, inciting incidents in the conflict. But I think we are almost, because it becomes almost like a cliche when victims' families appeal for no retaliation. I kind of think we should sort of take pause and take a beat and think just how big, you know, a gesture that is, like how noble at your sort of lowest ebb or whatever, like when you're, you know, the emotions must be coursing through you, the adrenaline must be coursing through you, and yet the instinct is to kind of appeal, and more often than not, it is based on Christian faith, and like, you know, Rosie McConville's her son is rubbing his legs. She's like, she was paralyzed after the Blairi Bingo bus shooting, lived on for 11 years, and her son says, you know, she'd be better off dying that night, which is a tragic thing for any child to say about their parent, but she suffered such pain, and he used to rub her legs and try and give her relief. And he said, if ever, I think he was 15 or 16, he said, if I ever find out who did it, Mum, I'm going to kill them. And she said, son, I pray for them every night. And then the mother, who had also lost her father in the same attack, said, you know, she said the rosary for the murderers. So that's enormous to me. And I think that's, you know, I think we need to sort of take a bit of time and sort of reflect on that. Likewise, Dixon McCrum, the uncle of Alan McCrum that I mentioned earlier, the 11-year-old boy, and he spoke, you know, he sort of said that is, you know, what happened is it's God's will, or we must accept it as God's will, or whatever. You know, that, you know, that was something that I kind of learned from the book, that you know, religion was kind of partly to blame, but it also was like a kind of a backstop that saved this place from descending into former Yugoslavia levels of internecine conflict.
So I do have one question about religion online. I think maybe you might have answered it already, but as church attendance levels fall across the board and successive censuses show fewer people attending any particular faith, do you feel this could play a part in tensions easing in the north of Ireland?
You know, probably not really, to be honest, because like, I think the people carrying it out, like, were, you know, even back in the 70s, there were cultural Catholics and Protestants rather than, you know, I don't think people were being murdered for their views on transubstantiation or whatever. You know, I think it's, you know, you know, people's, you know, people who turned to violence did so for kind of I think my understanding is a kind of a complex mix of, you know, it wasn't so much to do with faith as just sort of like maybe a faith-based or identity, but it was kind of like a mixture of, you know, identifying as Irish or British as well as Catholic or Protestant, whatever. So, you know, I don't know how many of these people sort of, like, I think there were a few that were devoutly practicing or whatever on both sides, but yeah, sorry, short answer is probably not. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, I haven't read the book yet, Martin, but thing to do. So
Thanks.
it's a local history, I suppose you could say.
Yeah.
How conscious were you, I suppose, in the broader spectrum of the history of Ireland, and particularly as part of Ireland, of the sort of the intimate nature of communities and the divisions within communities and how they developed, how this sort of this period fitted in with the rest? I mean, you talked about the 1920s and stuff as well. So,
Yeah.
You see it as a continuum or what?
Yeah, there definitely are threads, and not just 1920. Like the prologue to the book goes back to 1641. And I don't know if it means anything, but I was struck by the fact that before Pat Campbell was shot dead, there was a raid on a massive raid on a UDR armory on the 23rd of October. And the year before, there had been a massive raid on a UDR armory in Lurgan on the 23rd of October. So that's a bit of a coincidence. But then when, I'm reading about 1641 and I read that the 23rd of October was the date that the 1641 rebellion started, and that it was, a law in Ireland, when the Church of Ireland was the Anglican Church was the state church, it was by law that had to be marked by a sermon in every Anglican church, the denunciation of this Catholic atrocities against Protestants. And I kind of thought, that's a big coincidence. Maybe it doesn't mean anything, but maybe it actually does. Like Robin Jackson was from Donegal, and in the kind of the Trinity depositions about massacres in 1641, Donegal was listed as one of them. So
He was sort of notorious, wasn't he, as being one of the worst killers in history?
he absolutely was. Now, I'm just sort of speculating. Was one of the driving forces. Some sort of told tales that he had heard about a massacre in his native Donegal in 1641. It's not beyond the bounds of possibility.
Sort of Billy Wright, I suppose, took over from him, didn't he? Really, as the kind of bogeyman of. And indeed, he was a bogeyman of local Catholics, but it's even in those days in 1640s, you had that sort of figure, that kind of shadowy figure of doing harm to.
Yeah, well, the perpetrator in my parish in that case was a local Catholic chieftain or Philomene McNeil, whatever. Like, I guess I do want the book to be sort of, or seen as a sort of, it could be representative of the North as a whole, but of course it can't be because, like Bloody Sunday and Ballymurphy Massacre and the Shankill bombing, how do you can't tell the story of those, terrible atrocities through what happened in Funalish. But, the linen industry is the defining, like, I think a lot of people would see the North as, Samson and Goliath, the Harlan Wolf, whatever, as that is the kind of symbol of northern industry. But actually, the linen industry was, widespread throughout the North, along every river, the Bann, the Lagan, up to upper lands in Derry, whatever. Like, so that is like a kind of a representative sort of thread for northern culture, if you like, which I thought was an interesting thing to draw on and explore a little.
Okay. Time for one or two more questions. Got Adrian first.
Yeah, thanks. A Princeton academic called Stathis Calibas, if I pronounced his name correctly, wrote a book called Logic of Violence and Civil Wars. And what he argues for is that in many civil wars, the settling of schools, local reasons come to actually motivate quite a lot of violence that actually bears no relationship to, as it were, the national aims of the two antagonists. I wonder if there's sort of echoes of that in some of the stories that you have picked up.
I'm not sure. Like, that's definitely something I believe happened in the Irish Civil War.
Right.
Like, a lot of big houses were burnt or whatever. Like, I think that was opportunistic. Like, I think there was, a bit of land grabbing going on in terms of maybe driving out to Protestant landowners in the South, whatever, like, not necessarily for sectarian reasons, but purely sort of opportunism to kind of, seize on weakness or whatever to build an estate. And I think on the even internecine violence in the Irish Civil War between, pro-treaty and anti-treaty IRA, like, there absolutely, there is evidence, there are examples of, people being finger or identified by their neighbours as a traitor or whatever else, purely for for personal spite or again for local advantage. In the north, who knows? Like, again, with some of these murders, like, what was the instigating factor? Why them rather than somebody else? Like, often, like, there was sort of resentment about, say, Catholics who were doing well. Like, quite often they'd be maybe a publican because, if you're discriminated against in the civil service and maybe industry and whatever, how do you kind of, get on in life? Well, maybe, you open a pub and, you make a success that way, whatever, like, and, like, it really struck me in the book, say, James McCartan, who was an All-Ireland winning footballer for Down. Like, if he was from Kerry, that would be a license to print money, having a pub, whereas he was from Donaghcloney. So it was a nightmare for him. He was persecuted by local loyalists, whatever, planted bombs, issued threats, used to put black flowers on the windscreens of locals who went there, warning them off. So, like, there definitely was. So the O'Dowds, were they targeted because they were, relatively prosperous local Catholics, or was it because they were members of the SDLP? Who knows? But, like, certainly one thing you can say is that the result is radicalization. One relative went on to join the IRA, and another, relative went on to become a Sinn Féin supporter, and in fact a Sinn Féin minister.
So one last question from the back.
Thanks, Martin. I'm looking forward to reading your book. I'm not yet, but I'm from Banbridge.
Oh wow!
I was
Okay.
family.
Well done. Like condolences.
Yeah. But really, what I kind of wanted to ask was, I suppose, as someone that's from there and who's grown up there. Well, for me, I have been struck by how little I recognised from what you were saying. I didn't even know who was, a one Guildford in the pub, and it's 5 minutes away from my house. So I suppose my question is, what do you think the appetite is maybe in our area or our town to kind of commemorate what's happened, talk about it, and what's your experience being launching the book in Dromore? I think you were to be at Epic Brilliant as well.
Yeah.
What's your experience been in our area launching this book? What's the appetite to maybe commemorate the troubles in our place a bit more?
I had a local launch in Lawrencetown, actually, where I'm from, in the kind of the parish centre. There was over 100 people there, including a lot of the relatives. That was very heartening for me. Even, a representative from the Fagan family who weren't actually interviewed for the book, but their story is in it. So that was heartening. There's been a very positive response, kind of people talking about it. They're learning, like, even people whose stories are in the book, they're kind of, they know their own story maybe inside out, but they maybe, it's sort of seeing it as part of a bigger jigsaw. They're telling me that they've learned a lot from it. I think there is a level of resistance maybe to some of the stuff. Like, I guess I thought long and hard before, including the Paula Jordan story. So she's a Catholic from Lawrencetown who's principal of a special needs school in Dungannon, but she went to Banbridge Academy a few years above me. And I tell the story of how our headmaster, Frank Dorman, deliberately tried to sabotage her university career by giving her a terrible reference. So, I've, at least 2 of his sons were at the school. One was the year above me in my sister's year. Another one was in my cousin Michael and Damien's year. So, I can imagine, they mightn't be best pleased or whatever, like, but I kind of think, it's an important story. Like, I think there is, the history of the conflict is not the history of the IRA turning a civil rights movement into a insurrection or an attempt to foment revolution. That's part of it, but it's also a story of sectarianism that's been an undercurrent if not a riptide in the history of this place since the plantation, is the truth. And I think it's a spectrum, and it starts with sectarian slurs and whatever, which I endured at the academy, and it spans all the way to the activities of Billy Wright and Robin Jackson. I think that's maybe a painful thing for people to contemplate, certainly to accept. The hostility I've got, you know, I got one sort of message from a guy that was a few years above me at school, unsolicited, sort of saying, you know, I'm from a mixed marriage, my parents are from a mixed marriage, I had lots of Catholic friends, I have never spoken to anybody who had anything to say about sectarianism at the academy. I looked at his profile, and the two people, you know, we share in common, they're both in my book. One of them's Paula Jordan. So talk to Paula, knock yourself out.
We could go on. I'm sure there are many more questions, comments people would like to make, but I promised Martin that we'd finish by 3:30 so he can get away to the BBC to his next engagement.
Don't worry, it's radio.
So, thank you all very much for coming, whether you're online or in the room. It's been a great event, Martin. Thank you so much for giving us your time. It's an important book and it's a great read. So if you haven't read it already, I really strongly recommend it. And as I say, available. No Alibis is the closest bookstore just around the corner on Botanic. I'm sure they'll have copies around there.
That's great. Thanks, Peter. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.